As we look at the changing face of healthcare around the world, it's hard not to be distracted by the changes in medical technology, because they are truly extraordinary. Particularly those in the West who have access to the resources needed to buy them, have access to amazing techniques which even a generation ago would have seemed quite impossible and beyond our grasp. Medicine has hooked up with the technological revolution to be able to deliver healthcare in quite new ways. I say it's easy to be distracted by these developments because it is a mistake to believe that the fundamental changes taking place in healthcare today are primarily changes in technology. Behind those changes, and at a level in the long term of even greater significance, are changes in human values, changes in the moral structure within which medicine is operating, changes in the view of human nature which lies behind medical practice. This is most true and most clear in Western Europe and North America. But of course it is becoming equally true and equally clear in those other parts of the world which have closest connections with the Western medical tradition, which are most dependent upon Western medical technology and the kind of vision of medicine which is now bound up with the medical practice being delivered in the West. And what I would like to do is to seek to focus our attention behind the technological changes and changes in healthcare delivery systems and other discussions taking place in the contemporary international medical scene on the changes in the value system of medicine which are behind and which increasingly are influencing the changes in practical healthcare delivery and which are not influencing it for the better. Let me begin by going back into the history of this discussion of medical values, the coinage of the term bioethics just 25 years ago. 20 years before then, the development of a revolution in the discussion of values in medicine, in which, for the first time in the 1950s, people began writing explicitly in favor of challenging and changing the value system of medicine as it has come down to us through many hundreds of years. It's always hard to know where to say things have started and where to draw attention to those first influences, because this goes back a long way. But in the post-war years in the West, we saw the beginning of a fundamental shift in medical values, even at the same time as the world medical community was seeking to reinvigorate its ethical basis in reaction to what took place in Nazi Germany under the Nazi medicine, in which, of course, a fundamental shift in moral values led to euthanasia and led to widespread malpractice. After the war, the World Medical Association gathered and prepared the famous document known as the Declaration of Geneva, which is in many ways, and was intended to be, a restatement of the ancient medical tradition which we associate with the Hippocratic Oath. And that declaration has remained the gold standard for international medical values ever since. It has been amended, but it remains intact, largely, as a statement of what is good in the value system of international medicine. But so shortly after that declaration was promulgated in the late 1940s, we had the first shots fired in the engagement with a whole new vision of medicine. And so, for example, perhaps the best text, if you want to read about these things, lies in a book by Joseph Fletcher, who was the prophet of situation ethics a decade later, and whose book, Medicine and Morals, offers a manifesto for a whole new look at issues like euthanasia, abortion, all the central questions of medical values. And in that book, he essentially argues that on each of these questions we have been wrong and we need to change. Now, Fletcher's book was not, at the time, enormously significant, but as we look back, we see it as the first major attempt to bring about a revision of the way in which medical values have been understood in the West. The Declaration of Geneva was not simply meant to be a restatement of traditional medical values. It was meant, above all, to be a restatement of those values associated with that one document which has been most significant in the Western tradition and which stands behind the Christian and Judeo-Christian values of medicine. It stands behind the distinctives of one nation and another nation in their medical cultures. It comes down to us from pre-Christian pagan times, and yet remains one of the most famous documents in the history of the world. And that document, of course, is the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath, the document which goes back 400 years BC, a document whose influence is still profound in shaping the character of our medical tradition and the nature of our professional practice. And that is evident in many ways. And we will look in a minute at some of the particular values which we find in the oath, some of the individual ethical commitments which have helped shape our medical tradition and which are there for all to see. But it's worth saying, first of all, that the significance of the oath is nowhere more evident in the fact that there are medical oaths. That is to say, in so many countries, in so many medical and paramedical professional organizations, doctors and nurses and others feel they need to have statements of ethical vision at the heart of professional practice. Now, this is really something which we are very used to, but it's something which is very strange, in that there are other professional organizations around the world, and they may have good practice statements, and they may have notions of right and wrong in what is appropriate, but they all fall far short of operating on the kind of ethical basis on which medicine has sought to operate. It is most evident, of course, in the context of medical education, in that so many medical schools in the Western world continue to use some kind of oath or declaration in the context of their graduation ceremonials. It is the case that most North American medical schools do something of this kind. Many European medical schools do something of this kind. And even though the oaths they use have changed, even though not very many use the original Hippocratic Oath, for so many of these institutions, it is normal to associate commitment to a very particular moral vision with graduation as technically competent in the preparation of the young physician. And of course, in the history of Russia, the oath of the Soviet physician was written as a Sovietization of the Hippocratic tradition. The tradition was carried on, that there should be some kind of oath at the basis of medicine, even in a society which was to be founded upon atheistic principles. Now, if we have a look at the oath, we see many things. We see, however, most important of all, that it is an oath. That is to say, it is a document which is intended to affirm the fundamental interrelationship between the practice of medicine and God. It isn't a declaration like the Declaration of Geneva, which in many ways symbolizes the post-war world as a world still seeking to build upon the values of the past, but denying their theistic foundation, denying their origin in God, and thereby discovering an increasingly fragile hold upon those values. And so it is that the Hippocratic Oath is an oath and sets the relationship of physician and patient, the relationship of physician and profession, in the context of the relationship between each of them and God, and thereby holds them accountable. And if we have a look at some of the specifics of the oath, we see how distinctive is the moral vision of this particular kind of medicine which was, of course, foundational not simply for the medicine of the Christian West, the Judeo-Christian West, but also for Islam and for the entire medical tradition of a culture. We see the values of the oath perhaps in three sections. And we can note, first of all, the significance of the oath statements in the matter of medical etiquette. And so, for example, we have a whole series of commitments. We have a commitment to help the sick and not to take advantage of the access the physician has to the patient household. This commitment, which of course is explicitly concerned with sexual impropriety, even here with sexual impropriety with the patient's slaves. The principle is that the patient household is the context of privileged access, and that the physician has no other right of access to that house than by virtue of the relationship of the physician and the patient, which is to be a healing relationship. We could also refer to the still highly influential principle of patient confidentiality. That is to say, this tradition, which today remains significant for us, as professionals say that they have a relationship with a client or a patient which forbids them to speak of those things which they have been told in confidence, this is where it comes from. It comes from the Hippocratic Oath itself, in which the physician commits himself not to share those things which he has in confidence. Indeed, it goes beyond that. The physician commits himself not to share those other things he hears about the patient in general conversation. And the principle is very clear. The physician's relationship with the patient is privileged. It can never be anything other than the kind of relationship which is appropriate to a physician and a patient. And the physician will in no way exploit that relationship for other reasons. And so it is that we have two key principles here of what we might call medical etiquette. Then, of course, we have the famous principles which we might refer to as the principles of medical ethics proper. And we refer here, of course, to the basic principle of healing, what has been called Hippocratic philanthropism, the commitment of the physician to the good of the patient. And so the oath says, I will use treatment to help the sick according to my ability and judgment, but I will never use it to injure or wrong them. Here is a fundamental commitment. And if we bear this statement in mind as we look at the abuses of medicine in Nazi Germany, or, for example, the abuses of psychiatry in the Soviet Union, we see very clear examples of physicians using medicine to injure and wrong patients. And here in the oath, perhaps the first principle of Hippocratic medicine is to use medicine to heal and never to harm. But then, of course, we have some specific statements. And most specific of all are the statements about the sanctity of life. Very interesting. We get involved today in discussions about abortion and euthanasia. Abortion remains a major problem, liberal abortion, all over much of the world. Abortion is now widely practiced. Euthanasia is increasingly a threat to us. It is an option in public policy. And there are now 1 or 2 countries in which it's practiced legally. Well, these are not just new questions. They are also old questions. And we go back to the Hippocratic Oath and we have guidance. Because in the ancient world, plainly, both of these practices took place. Both of them were options in clinical management for physicians. And the Hippocratic physicians decided that they were going to say no. And so in relation to abortion, a very specific statement here, I think it's interesting that Hippocrates wasn't an ivory tower ethicist. He was a clinician, a highly concrete thinker. And so he says, not that abortion is wrong, but that he will not do it, even though asked that he will not give a woman a pessary to cause an abortion, a very specific statement about one of the common methods of causing abortion in the ancient world. And again, he will not give poison though asked to do so. The physician will not get involved, even in what we now call physician-assisted suicide, even if the patient requests. And of course, physicians then were often their own pharmacists. They would carry poisons with them, and plainly it was a common practice for the physician in certain circumstances, if asked to do so, to provide the patient with poison. Here the physician says no. So we find at the heart of the substantive vision of moral medicine a commitment to healing, the good of the patient, and in specific terms a commitment to what we could now call the sanctity of life. That is to say, that the vision for the good of the patient was qualified and contained in a commitment to the sanctity of life. The relationship of physician and patient could not lead to any other commitment than that the patient's life would be preserved and safeguarded by the physician. And then finally, thirdly, we can refer to the subject with which we began, which is what I call the covenantal structure of medicine. And so this begins, of course, with this oath, an oath taken to pagan gods. It's very interesting. This isn't some kind of sectarian Christian document. It's a document common to the Western tradition, and it's a document which took shape in ancient Greece when there were pagan gods, and these were the relevant pagan gods for medical purposes. And so it is that the physician swears by these gods that he will be committed to this particular vision of moral medical practice. And we believe that this document arose in the context of Pythagorean religion, the religious philosophical group of the Pythagoreans, and that it represents their own vision for medical practice. It's an oath. And the context of the oath, of course, is one in which these particular values are contested, and the physician is committed in the presence of God. In this context, the presence of many gods. In the presence of God, committed to a very distinctive moral vision for medical practice, as over against all the other options, which then as now were open. Interestingly, we also find here not simply an oath sworn privately to God, not simply a physician on his knees, if you like, saying, this is how I will do medicine. We see the physicians grouped together in a guild, in a group which prefigures what we now call the profession of medicine. Because, of course, there is a whole section here at the beginning of the oath, not often read, although a section very appealing to those of us who are teachers, in which the teacher of the physician is spoken of in glowing terms, and a series of commitments entered to care for the teacher, to teach the teacher's own children medicine in due time, to support the teacher if he becomes indigent. We have a series of commitments which prefigure the development of a mutually accountable profession as the moral context within which medicine is practiced not simply privately before God, but in a community before God, and in which there is mutual accountability. That is the shape of the Hippocratic Oath. Now, we don't know much about the history of the Hippocratic tradition. We don't know much detail. We have snapshots, we have glimpses into that tradition. We know, for example, that the early Christians, while they were examining the products of the pagan civilization of their day, that they came across this particular product of that paganism, and they liked it. And they decided not to discard it, but rather to build upon it. And although it had pagan elements in these listing of gods at the beginning, they came to the conclusion that the vision for a medicine founded firmly on this particular moral vision was one with which they could align themselves. And so Hippocratic medicine became what we might now call Christian Hippocratism. And the Christian Hippocratic vision was the vision that lay behind the founding of the great medieval university medical schools, as medicine was developed at the heart of Western culture as perhaps the single most distinct cultural artifact which has survived down to our own day from ancient times. Medicine was founded upon this Christian Hippocratic vision of the physician-patient relationship under God, always exercised before God, and in the mutual accountability of the profession. Now, that is a bird's-eye view of where we have come from, and indeed of where we are to an extent, because although much of this has begun to change in those countries where, until so recently, it was still highly explicit and articulated, to a substantial degree, the remnants of this tradition are still in place. And so, for example, we may believe that the basis of the physician-patient relationship is trust. It's a fiduciary relationship, one built upon trust, one that has to be built upon trust, because, of course, of the inequalities of the relationship. Because the physician is always going to have all sorts of power the patient will never have. So unless there is trust, unless there is counterbalancing responsibility, unless there is accountability for the physician in the profession and ultimately before God, then medicine simply will not work. There are many things that you can do, many contractual relationships you can enter with all sorts of people to buy a car or to buy a house or to engage in all kinds of commercial transactions with people whom you do not trust. But it's in the nature of the relationship of a sick person and the person caring for that person that without trust, the relationship cannot work. And if the relationship doesn't work, then medicine fails. It is the case that in many countries, people distrust doctors in general. It is still the case that they trust their own physician. And it is when that trust begins to ebb, when people perhaps here in America might consider taking their lawyer along to visit the physician, to make sure the physician is held accountable, that of course medicine will fall apart. And those of us who are concerned about the tendency of these trends, the secularization of the profession, the focus on technology and technique, on a contractual understanding of the relationship of physician and patient, a distrusting relationship. Those of us who are concerned about these things aren't merely concerned at a theoretical level. We are concerned that medicine finally will fail to deliver what we now call healthcare if these trends continue in their present direction. I'd like to make a particular comment about the decline of the theistic context of medicine, because that, of course, is of enormous significance for our understanding of what it is that physicians are called to do. It was a tragic irony that when the world medical community sought to regroup, to restructure in the aftermath of the horrors of the Second World War, that the Declaration of Geneva, which they put together, seeking to recapture the grand vision of Hippocratic moral medicine, should have emerged to be a declaration and not an oath. That is to say, it is a statement in two dimensions, a statement of some people to other people on their own. Whereas, of course, an oath is a statement that one makes to and before God. And although this is symbolism, it is, it seems to me, symbolism of a high order and of enormous significance. Because whatever those people thought they were doing at the end of the 1940s, they were in fact ushering in an age of fundamental ethical change. And one reason why that ethical change has been so fast is that, of course, it has been changed into an ethical context in which God has been left out of account. Now, the next stage in this process, if we go on from the 1950s and the early developments then to the 1970s, which have provided the immediate framework for our understanding today, what we see is that bioethics has arisen as a new discipline, not simply a new version of the old discipline, which we called medical ethics, and which dealt with the kind of things laid out in the Hippocratic Oath. But medical ethics has been transformed into bioethics. And bioethics, in almost all of its manifestations, is a secular enterprise, an enterprise engaged after God, post-God, for the post-Christian society. an enterprise in which the theistic roots of the moral vision of medicine are denied, and in which we find ourselves agreeing on only one value in the pluralism of the post-Christian society. Only one value is left intact, and that is the importance of allowing other people to think what they want. The one common value is the value of diversity and respect for other people's opinions. And so the primary focus of bioethics has been not on discovering whether abortion is right or wrong, or even whether euthanasia is right or wrong. That discussion has largely been left behind in a tacit agreement that whether these things are right or wrong is no longer of primary significance. The value which remains is the value of allowing people to think what they like about these questions. And so the bioethics agenda has been focused primarily on devising what we might call protocols for pluralism, ways of allowing people to think and practice differently, privately, according to their own particular vision, in a context in which the culture at large and the medical profession, at the sharpest focus of that culture in its treating of human dignity and healthcare, has chosen to abandon its roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and therefore in the Christian Hippocratic focus for medicine, and instead to reinvent its notion of itself as a culture which finds its values in a post-Christian identity. Now, back of that, there is one factor which we need never to forget in this discussion, and that is that the central conviction of any culture, the central premise on which any culture operates, is its idea of what it means to be human. And when you think about it, this is obvious enough. Every culture, a tribal culture or a great sophisticated technological culture, operates on some kind of assumption about the meaning of human life. And of course, in our tradition, the tradition of Christianity, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, a tradition of what we call the West, although of course it spreads around much of the world, this tradition is founded foursquare on a very distinctive vision of what it means to be human. And we say to be human means to bear the image of God. The image of God, this mysterious but central construct of the biblical view of the world, determines and defines what it means to be human. And so, our culture has been built inconsistently, problematically, but nevertheless definitely, on the assumption that to be human is to bear the dignity of God himself, to reflect that dignity in a proportion appropriate to creatures of time and space like us. And in that connection, medicine, Judeo-Christian medicine, building on the Hippocratic vision, has of course been intertwined at point after point with that notion of human dignity at the very heart of its enterprise. And there have been problems. But when that medical tradition has been truest to itself, when the culture has been truest to itself, then the principle of human dignity arising out of the image of God and of medicine treating people as if they bore the image of God has been central and has been practical and has led to the kind of medical treatment and medical trust which, of course, in our culture has lain at the very heart of our humane experience. Now, the point I want to make is this, that as this culture, this common Western culture, spread around North America, Europe, Russia, those other parts of the world where what we call the West has planted its Judeo-Christian feet. As this culture today strives to reinvent itself in post-Christian terms, the first casualty, the most serious casualty, is its notion of what it means to be human. At one and the same time, it seems to me the culture is both forgetting its notion of what it meant to be human, forgetting what it means to be human, and then seeking to reinvent its notion of what it means to be human, to come up with a post-Christian model of human nature. to come up with an understanding of human being which is cut loose and free from the baggage of the Western tradition, and therefore from the dignity, the inestimable dignity attaching to each human being, which lies at the heart of such public policy concepts as the rule of law and the human rights basis of international law, and which lies also at the heart of our humane vision of what it means to practice medicine. And that is why these discussions in bioethics are quite so significant. That is why the changing face of healthcare, the changing face of the moral vision of healthcare, is an epitome of the culture, lies at the very heart of the changes taking place in this sad and decaying Western tradition in the midst of which we find ourselves. Because bioethics is becoming the test bed for post-Christian ideas of human nature. And as we get involved in discussions about the use of human embryos, the creation of human embryos, essentially for purposes of vivisection, for deleterious experimentation and death, as we find ourselves involved in discussions about the killing of elderly and sick people, as we find ourselves involved in discussions about a revision of every canon of medical ethics, this is not an accident. It is all the implication of our seeking to change the half-forgotten vision we have of human dignity as that which arises out of our being made in the image of God, and that which has been the fundamental substrate of our understanding of human being down many centuries of Western culture. That is the kind of significance these discussions about bioethics have today. And that is the kind of practical significance which the bioethics discussion has for our treatment of individuals, and above all, for our treatment of individuals in the context of the practice of healthcare. Thank you.